We just sort of need to change the culture. But right now, all the incentives for scientists are to get that paper published in Nature or Science or one of the really high-impact journals with a really sexy press release with something that makes people go, wow.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com coming to you in a conversation that's being recorded on the 10th of June, 2016 here in Japan. Today I'm joined on the line by Judith Curry, a professor of climatology who was the former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She's the co-author of Thermodynamics of Atmospheres and Oceans and co-editor of Encyclopedia of Atmospheric Sciences. She's published over 140 scientific papers. She has her own blog at judithcurry.com. And attentive Corbett Report listeners will know that I did also post her testimony at the Commerce Committee hearing on Data or Dogma back in December of 2015. So I'll put the link in the show notes to all of those resources so you can check them out. Dr. Judith Curry, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Excellent. Well, as I just told you off air, I've been following your work for years. Your blog is excellent and really a valuable resource for people who are looking for insight into the sticky science/policy issues that arrive out of uncertain sciences like climate science. So I will direct people there if they haven't been to Climate Etc. yet, and I hope they will do so. But I wanted to use as the springboard for our conversation a recent blog post that you had on The Republic of Science, which is also the title of a 1962 essay by Hungarian-British polymath Michael Polanyi, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, who was a chemist and a philosopher and an economist and did all sorts of amazing work, including writing an essay called The Republic of Science, Its Political and Economic Theory. Rather than me trying to butcher what this essay is about and putting it into its proper context, perhaps you can explain a little bit about this essay and why your thoughts turned to it recently.
Well, the essay, to understand where this is coming from, Polanyi was Hungarian, and he was very concerned about oppression of science in sort of the top-down kind of government that he saw. And so he wrote this essay, as a plea for decentralized science. And again, the essay in the 1960s reflects sort of a mid-century view of elite science just at the time when the UK and US were contemplating big government investments into science. And so he used a market kind of analogy to how scientists work, and the invisible hand, and analogies to market where the coin of the realm is really more publications and respect by your peers, okay, which is how that goes. And I can't even remember why I was reminded. It was a tweet. Somebody tweeted, and it reminded me of this essay, and I thought, oh my gosh. I mean, it's really fun to look at that and see what science looks like today and how that vision, really matches up. And of course, I was personally interested in looking at how this is playing out in terms of the policy relevant sciences, climate science being, my personal area of expertise, but the same concerns that I have about how this is playing out in climate science, you also see in the psychological sciences, in nutrition, medical sciences as well, where the invisible hand is no longer invisible, is very much driven by politics, government investment, and commerce. Okay, and this is torquing science, big science in very different ways that were not envisioned by Polanyi. And some of the sort of checks and balances in the system that Polanyi wrote about have become dysfunctional. And so the market is no longer a free market of ideas, if you will, but something that's, become very much torqued by government politics and commerce.
So, on the note of Polanyi's identification of those forces that work to moderate science, let me just quote a couple of paragraphs from his essay where he says, both the criteria of plausibility and of scientific value tend to enforce conformity, while the value attached to originality encourages dissent. This internal tension is essential in guiding and motivating scientific work. The professional standards of science must impose a framework of discipline and at the same time encourage rebellion against it. They must demand that in order to be taken seriously, an investigation should largely conform to the currently predominant beliefs about the nature of things, while allowing that in order to be original, it may to some extent go against these. The authority of scientific standards is thus exercised for the very purpose of providing those guided by it with the independent grounds for opposing it. The capacity to renew itself by evoking and assimilating opposition to itself appears to be logically inherent in the sources of the authority wielded by scientific orthodoxy. Does that correspond, in your experience, to the standards of scientific orthodoxy and rebellion that we're seeing play out right now? And if so, how?
Well, it feels like physics that are relatively untouched by, politics and commerce. I think Polanyi's ideals still hold up. But once you have politics and commerce entering into this, it becomes very difficult to be a maverick, so to speak. There are huge incentives against being a maverick. I mean, how did the dietary cholesterol pronouncements, sustain for many, many decades without being challenged? And then all of a sudden it just fell apart on a time scale of 6 months. How does that happen? Well, there's a lot of commercial interests and, the grand poobahs of science, who declare something. And it's, when your funding and your reputation depends on favorable opinions by the big shots in science, so to speak, it's just not in your interest to go against that. And so that sort of stifles the kind of, the dissent that, Polanyi sought. In physics, it's still, the goal to really overturn the way, something about the way people think. But in a field like climate science or nutrition, it's not good for your career. I mean, at least in the short term. And the young scientists can't really buck the establishment. They do so at the risk of their career. And I've talked to too many young scientists, in the climate field who, are either keeping their heads down and just not working on certain problems, or who are leaving the field. And that's not, so the invisible hand is not invisible anymore, and it's torquing science in a certain direction, and and there's a social contract between the elite scientists and the governments, the funding stays high, it's like, and it's implicit, but it is very much embedded in everything that we do in climate science. And it's very tough to be a maverick, if you will, and try to go against the grain.
Well, these are the questions that you gesture towards in the comments in that blog post, where you say, what happens when the externalities of the Republic of Science produce perverse incentives and careerism becomes a dominant incentive that requires publishing a lot of papers rapidly and producing headline-worthy results? Who even cares if these papers don't survive scrutiny beyond their press release? You also say, what happens when the hand guiding science isn't invisible, i.e. science is driven by politics, such as a political imperative to move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy? And these aren't rhetorical questions. They are questions that have answers, and I think your biography might provide some of them. You use the polite term, or even in some ways the heroic term maverick, to describe the dissent that Polanyi wants to see happening in science. But the actual word that has been applied to yourself, and I'm sure to others, is heretic, which is an amazing word to be applied to scientists, for people
Yeah,
dissenting from the scientific orthodoxy.
exactly. It's climate science has become a religion, and even the you know ideology, dogma, heresy, and whatever are all too often um, used in climate science. And the treatment by people such as me who don't diverge from the consensus all that much. I'm nothing, I'm not denying anything um, other than the science and policy, the science policy interface is working. I'm denying that. That's one thing I deny. I think it's become dysfunctional. But there has to be a place for the relatively minor kinds of dissent against the consensus science and the policy prescriptions du jour. I mean, there has to be room for that. And the fact that there isn't in the institutions of science is very disturbing.
It certainly is. And I guess my next question is a loaded question, because if you had an answer to it, I'm sure you would have answered it by now. But the question is, given that these are the problems, and they are there, and they are apparent, and they are easily observable by, I think, disinterested parties, what is the answer, or how do we proceed towards answering these problems? Especially because the dice are so incredibly loaded against the Mavericks in this case. What can possibly be done to change the institutional momentum that's welded into place by the combination of money, power, and authority?
Well, this is a topic of my next blog post, which I hope to have up by the end of the week. And the closest that I've seen to a thorough analysis of this problem is a new book called Science on the Verge. It's a series of chapters, mostly European scientists, and it analyzes the problem, the symptoms, it describes all the symptoms, and it gives a historical context of how did this happen, and it describes some ideas for what we might do about it. And what they come up with, it's not going to be given the not so invisible hand of the government, and commerce. It's not going to be regulated from within science. The scientists themselves, it's just too much circling of the wagons and protecting their funding and their reputations, and that's not really going to change from within science. And so the solution that they have is really this, open it up to much wider scrutiny, by social scientists, people in other fields, and just citizens, and have people be involved in the evaluation, the discussion, just really open it up and sort of take it out of the ivory tower. And I think, how do you manage that? But certainly the blogosphere and the Twittosphere, is one way you do that. But the book is very good at articulating the problem and how we got there, and it provides one solution that I think is important. Whether it's the solution, I don't know, but it's an important book, and I hope to have my blog post finished by tomorrow, so it'll be there to discuss. But, some of the authors of that book might be interesting for you to talk to, at some point. But yeah, there's no simple answers to this, but the issue is people, and it's part of it's the public's problem because they want answers, to things that we don't have answers to, to say we don't know, or here are the uncertainties. It's imperative that scientists, when you have one of these socially relevant topics that you're working on, the uncertainties and the quality of your information and what you don't know, become even more important than your actual result. And it's important for scientists to, when working at the interface with decision makers, be them government or industrial, that you make it very clear what you don't know, and really objectively characterize the quality of the information that you do have, and talk about the uncertainties. And you just sort of need to change the culture. But right now, all the incentives for scientists are to get that paper published in Nature or Science or one of the really high impact journals with a really sexy press release with something that makes people go, wow. And then, then that's a big feather in your back. And, 2 weeks later, people may have found massive flaws in it, but it doesn't matter. You still got the publication, and you got your name in the mainstream media, and it looks good for your university, and it's a victory. Okay, even though it's a shallow victory, because it not only does not stand the test of time, but it acts to confuse people. So the incentives from within academia have gone a little haywire.
Right. Yes. In some ways, it doesn't seem like it's even that difficult of a problem because, as you say, in areas of particle physics or things that are very far removed from the public sphere, maybe that the traditional way that this has functioned can continue to function. But when it starts to impinge on various aspects of society that brings in various stakeholders with their own viewpoints and their own knowledge bases, if only we had a way to get all of these people interacting and talking to each other on a platform. Oh, it's called the internet. It's here. It's already here. Why is it not being made more use of? And this is another thing that you can speak of from your own experience, because, of course, you started your own blog several years ago. As I understand, at least partly as an attempt to engage with people who have these kinds of criticisms with climate science. So can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, this has been career changing. I started experimenting in the blogosphere, I think, around 2006, and I would just comment on some other technical blogs, some in the climate and some in the more broader environmental area. And I got sucked into some discussions that, it was just more reactionary to what they wanted to talk about. And I said, I want to start to, shape the dialogue and pick my own topics that I'm talking about. So I started my blog in 2010, and it has been career changing as well as life changing. And I've, networked with people all over the world in from many different walks of life, everything from policymakers to teachers to people in various industries, academics from other fields. It's just been tremendously enriching to learn about their perspectives, but they also have provided me with references to papers and articles, and they've just enriched, what I have access to. And even I've crowdsourced, I have a talk to prepare. I need some help with finding data and making plots. And, the people in the other hemisphere are working on it overnight. In the morning, I have new plots. And, it's just a fascinating way to network and engage. And, it's just been wonderful. It's sort of taken over my academic life in many ways, and I get zero credit for it. In fact, some people at my university most markedly do not like what I'm doing. But to me, this is and I've stopped worrying about what my peers in academia think of me. I've redefined my peer group to this much broader group of people. And, I'm having the time of my life. So, unfortunately, academics really don't get credit for this kind of work. And, it is what it is. But it would be wonderful if more people, took to engaging really engaging publicly. Too much, you know, the whole issue of communication. To me, communication is sort of a one-way street, where you make proclamations, but the whole engagement thing, that's really enabled by the internet, is wonderful. And I would hope to see more of that. And I think we're seeing a little bit more of that. But until the reward system in academia changes, it's just like, it's like pro bono work. It's not something you get credit for.
So open source science, peer-to-peer science, crowdsourced science, crowd-funded science. Can we even imagine something like that? It sounds like that the real revolution in science will not be televised, but maybe found online?
Yeah, and climate science is unique because the data is publicly available, and you can, and even the model runs, a lot of the models are publicly available. You can do it on your laptop. The analyses even run, some simpler climate models. You can do a lot of the work without funding. And so there's a lot of independent climate scientists who, some who are semi-retired, some who are just in other fields and are interested. And they're actually publishing papers, influential papers. And I have, like, this is a good one of my recent collaborators, Nick Lewis, and we published a fairly influential paper together, but it's maybe his sixth paper. But he's a semi-retired financier in the UK who knows a lot about Bayesian statistics. Okay, and he's putting that knowledge to work, on some climate problems and getting papers published. And this is a fairly unique phenomena in climate science. You don't see that in other fields. I mean, you don't need a laboratory. You don't need a lot of things. There's so much that's publicly accessible that people can start doing climate research outside of the normal institutions, government labs, universities, etc. So climate science is leading the way in that regard.
McIntyre and McKittrick might have started something, I guess.
McIntyre is another wonderful example of that.
Yeah, it is. It really is interesting from that perspective, because it is a science that draws in a lot of expertise from other areas that people can then use that may not have been directly involved with the ivory tower version of that science.
Yeah, especially anything related to data analysis. A lot of climate scientists, their statistics skills are not up to snuff. And generally in the field, we don't carefully evaluate the data analysis processes. And having people like Steve McIntyre and Nick Lewis, scrutinizing this has been tremendously valuable to the field. So,
yes. If only all the parties at the table recognized and admitted to that fact.
Yeah.
Oh, well. All right. Well, I don't want to monopolize your time. I do appreciate you taking time out of the schedule to talk with us, and I could talk with you for hours, I'm sure, but we'll leave it there for today. But before we go, please direct people again to your blog and tell us a little bit about the work there.
Okay. My blog is Climate Etc., and it's at judithcurry.com. And if you're on Twitter, my handle is CurryJA, and I point to my blog posts there also. And it's a blog that was originally developed to, for technical people interested in the climate debate broadly defined. The etc. It's not just about science. I would say maybe 20% of the posts are hardcore science. A lot of it is the sociology of science, ethics, a lot of energy issues, politics and policy related to climate science. So it's a broad smorgasbord of things related to science. And what I like, apart from my own posts, which I hope people find significant, but I've attracted, a group that comment actively. So, some of the posts have had over 2,000 comments, but routinely they get over, 200, 300 comments. So there's a lot of interesting discussion, and many very interesting people show up, some of whom are anonymous. I have no idea who they are. but are clearly educated in some way and feel the need to stay anonymous for some reason. Some of those reasons have been communicated to me. Oh, I'm in employment at a government agency. I could never speak out the way you do. Or even in companies, private sector companies, oh, I could never speak out, with my name and say these things. So, a lot of people in different environments don't feel comfortable speaking out publicly, because of fear of, reprisals from their employers. And that's not a good situation. But
sorry, folks. I'm afraid Judith Curry was having some internet problems, and we lost the connection at the very end of that conversation. But I will direct you to judithcurry.com. I hope you do go there and check out Climate, etc. It is a very interesting blog, and I hope that the conversation today entices you to do so. That's it for today. James Corbett, CorbettReport.com. Talk to you again real soon.
The Corbett Report is brought to you by the Corbett Report subscriber, a weekly newsletter featuring James Corbett's International Forecaster editorial, recommended reading and viewing, discounts on Corbett Report DVDs, and once a month, a subscriber-only video. Sign up today to start receiving your copy at corbettreport.com/support.
A Commerce Committee hearing on Data or Dogma back in December of 2015, so I'll put the link in the show notes to all of those resources so you can check them out. Dr. Judith Curry, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
well, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Excellent. Well, as I just told you off air, I've been following your work for years. Your blog is excellent and really a valuable resource for people who are looking for insight into the sticky science/policy issues that arrive out of uncertain sciences like climate and economic theory. Rather than me trying to butcher what this essay is about and putting it into its proper context, perhaps you can explain a little bit about this essay and why your thoughts turned to it recently.
Well, the essay, to understand where this is coming from, Polanyi was Hungarian, and he was very concerned about oppression of science in sort of the top-down kind of government. We just sort of need to change the culture. But right now, all the incentives for scientists are to get that paper published in Nature or Science or one of the really high-impact journals with a really sexy press release with something that makes people go, wow.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com coming to you in a conversation that's being recorded on the 10th of June, 2016 here in Japan. Today I'm joined on the line by Judith Curry, a professor of climatology who was the former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She's the co-author of Thermodynamics of Atmospheres and Oceans and co-editor of Encyclopedia of Atmospheric Sciences. She's published over 140 scientific papers. She has her own blog at judithcurry.com. And attentive Corbett Report listeners will know that I did also post her testimony at the Science. So I will direct people there if they haven't been to Climate, etc. yet, and I hope they will do so. But I wanted to use as the springboard for our conversation a recent blog post that you had on The Republic of Science, which is also the title of a 1962 essay by Hungarian-British polymath Michael Polanyi, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, who was a chemist and a philosopher and an economist and did all sorts of amazing work, including writing an essay called The Republic of Science, Its Political